Traumatic stress disorders persist as one of the most difficult public health challenges worldwide. Millions of people struggle to cope with and recover from the devastating effects of war, violence, poverty, hazardous occupations, and life-threatening diseases. While the causes of stress disorders are fairly well understood and treatments largely effective, prevention and eradication remains elusive. Among the greatest challenges is breaking the cycle of what can be termed intergenerational PTSD. Those who live with multi-generational trauma disorders face daunting challenges due to complex pathologies and often difficult social circumstances. Veterans, Native and African Americans, Holocaust, genocide, and assault survivors often suffer with dual historical and contemporary traumatology that make appropriate treatment and ongoing support difficult to provide and sustain. Beyond helping intergenerational trauma survivors cope and recover is the problem of prevention. Currently, most perilous occupations such as the military, police, and fire rescue do not screen for PTSD risk factors. Some have speculated that lack of prevention and comprehensive care for survivors is driven by an unacknowledged social political belief that high rates of PTSD are an acceptable cost advanced societies must pay to survive and prosper. While organizations exist today that advocate for prevention and improved care, PTSD survivors of every generation continue to face an often lonely struggle of moving from victim to survivor to thriving again one day.
Both of us didn't know what PTSD was. I was in the dark. He was scared. He didn't know what caused his PTSD.
He gave me what he gave me from his PTSD out of love. And it's the kind of love that you have on a battlefield. Never occurred to me that it was any kind of love at all until I got to Vietnam.
On some days, I can look in the mirror and I don't look like me. And that's when the depression sets in too. And you feel ugly and stupid and hopeless and helpless and useless.
Had no real clue about what had happened with me. I was broke, I didn't care, and I didn't understand why.
In thinking about the effects of psychological trauma of the first generation on the second generation, I think about a veteran I know who had young adult children of his own and had never talked to them about what he'd lived through. In part, he felt he was protecting them, and in part, I don't think he knew how to express what it was like for him to live through the things he lived through.
We do not know at this time exactly how this process of intergenerational traumatization takes place. What we know, though, is that a variety of mechanisms are involved.
He did what he did to try to teach me how to survive in a world that to him was very threatening. And my world as a kid was, this is just a world and I want to find out about it.
And if a child sees how the parents are affected by the trauma, has a significant impact. We need to remember, though, that approximately half of survivors of any kind do not like to talk about their trauma. And when they don't talk about the trauma, they, however, give certain nonverbal messages and signs which are picked up by the children.
He was in the Army and was shot. My dad's behaviors were very moody, angry, looking in these horrible looks. The silence, not knowing what his feelings were towards us. He tended to avoid us and work continually at 2 jobs. He made me feel very unwelcome. And I learned to keep my feelings to myself. I felt kind of torn in 2 ways, but kind of held back in a way.
growing up in a household where a parent's been traumatized and it's never talked about, and that's the case most often that I see in second generation. There's a toxic atmosphere. It's sort of the tyranny of silence. It's not healthy.
Now, a third mechanism of transmission is a process of re-traumatization of a child by the traumatized parents. Indeed, a parent that is suffering from PTSD with the irritability, the lack of patience, the explosive anger can do a lot of damage to the self-esteem of a child.
His volcanic anger was very much something that he didn't have control of. I did something wrong, the belt was going to come out. And my dad's telling me, watch the other man, be safe, do all this stuff, I'm in authority. And at the same time, he had an absolute need to be fair.
And growing up in an atmosphere like that, I think, makes somebody much more vulnerable. And then when they're traumatized, the initial, reaction is, well, it must be shameful, I can't talk about it, because it's been more of a toxic cloud over their lives rather than okay, when something happens to you, you have a right to hold your boundaries and say, this happened and it's not right.
I think the essence of trauma is a break between your sense of who you are and a new sense after the trauma of who you may be. It's a break between yourself and other people, and it's a break between you and the world you live in. For the second generation person, yes, they carry a double whammy. This happened to me, and I should have known it was going to happen because it happened to my father or my mother, and it's a curse that pursues us, and what else could the world ever be? Because very basic ideas about what sort of world this is are altered by traumatic events.
My father was Navy. I volunteered for the Navy in '67. Did my tours in Vietnam on minesweepers. When you go into a minefield, the constant second-by-second thought is, what's it going to feel like when the world blows up?
Most likely during the first months after the traumatic event, there will be an onset of insomnia, ruminative thoughts that you can't get out of your mind.
The kid who had lost control of the Thompson, he's the same kid I tried to talk out of going over the fantail. He threw himself into the screws of the ship. And I started having little flashes of seeing the fantail of the ship at night with phosphorescent water coming out of the back, and the deck is empty, and I feel like I'm going crazy.
Very often this is complicated by a form of losing touch from reality or being semi-aware of what is happening.
I worked with the mentally challenged for over 15 years, and I was assaulted on the job 3 separate times. And the third assault, I continued the shift, but the next day I couldn't go to work. I can remember kind of clinging onto the edge of a black hole. I felt like my mind and my body were disconnected. It was so strange. It was like I wasn't there. I had lost something. And I was helpless and very, very scared because I didn't know what was going to happen next, because I was afraid I was going to lose it or drive into a lake and end it all.
After I got back from Vietnam, I was pretty pissed off at the world and the military and the whole 9 yards. I really didn't know who I was. I didn't know what was going on. The world was just full of threats. I don't know how I survived. The absolute inner rage that I had.
The irony of it for me was that I spent 17 years as an Army wife, and for the first full year of our marriage, I'm watching this man going into his rages and not understanding it, thinking, oh no, is this going to be mistake number 3?
Very frequently, someone will say, I'm on my fifth, sixth wife, and she's leaving if I don't change. And they'll get into treatment and then start repairing the relationship.
When we think about the issue of coping and recovery, it's complicated because, on the one hand, the trauma may come as a confirmation of their worst fears. But we should also factor in that these are people that have learned that, as bad as the world might seem, life does go on, and maybe that's a battle they can engage in better for being a second-generation person.
I had a very difficult time asking for help because I was always the helper. And I happened to have an appointment with the doctor, and he diagnosed me immediately, and I was directed to the proper doctors who really understood PTSD.
Regarding the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, people have to be provided treatment at the multidisciplinary level. And the experience shows that when you combine cognitive therapy, individual long-term therapy, group therapy, and medications, the results are better.
Frequently in the beginning of treatment, people will say, I want to forget. And I tell them, I can't teach you to forget, but I can teach you to remember. And in remembering, you can have authority over the memories.
And by the time Kathy and I were married, I had it so suppressed that all I really remembered was that I was in the Navy. It was during Vietnam. We went over there and we floated around in the ocean, and I came home.
Of course, when we are talking about treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, in particular 2G PTSD, individuals who suffer from treatment-resistant PTSD do better in the long run when they develop a bond with a therapist.
I walked into the vet center and they assigned me to a female counselor. She understood us and helped me work through things that I didn't believe had really happened.
And most people I see in the beginning, they'll say, well, I didn't ever know really what happened because I could only look at the beginning and the end. But once they look at the entire thing, then they have memory, and then they can take it to the future and remember in their own way.
And the real gift that Karen gave me at that time was she would never lead me through that memory. And text came back to me over a period of months. And when I actually recalled that, yeah, I had spent the time trying to keep him from killing himself, I knew the memory was true.
In my experience, a lot of people have the illusion that if I can ever talk about it, I'll be okay. But then begins the real work of learning how to live back in the world again with a different focus in your life.
If I work on the car and end up having to throw a car part, I can go pick the car part up later, and I can try to come to an understanding of what the rage is and where it came from. All the reading up we've done about PTSD says that there are permanent chemical changes in your brain. My brain is now hardwired to assess threat. Okay, fine. I'll go into a situation and I'll assess threat. Doesn't mean I can't have a life.
And what we have learned is over the years that very often post-traumatic stress disorder does not go away entirely. There are some residual symptoms, and for those residual symptoms, it is important to keep in touch with your therapist, with your psychiatrist. If medications were used, very often staying on the medication, maintaining treatment is important, because we learn now that medications like the antidepressants and the mood stabilizers have a positive effect on the brain.
There are days that I feel normal, like they're few and far between, but they're more than they used to be. And this is like 4 years now for me, and that is the neatest feeling.
What we know now is that people who have some vulnerability in one area of their lives have resiliency in other areas. This is significant because it shows that during our lifetime we can modify that was given to us by the parents.
Breaking the cycle, I think it can be broken, like in my family. I thought there was something very similar to me and with my father. I went to my psychiatrist and I described my father and how he acted as I was growing up, and he said, oh yeah, he has PTSD. So I really feel that, speaking up can break the cycle.
Some of the men in my maintenance groups, they want to help other guys. They want everyone else to know what they know. And I use them as peer counselors in group. It helps engender trust in the new people and make the others feel like they really have something to contribute.
The other part of the recovery has been his outreach work with other veterans. He befriended a young active duty Army guy. We call him Tank. His real name's Sean.
I was scared. I was terrified that he would die, and yeah, I had him connected with the kid I lost in Vietnam.
6 o'clock one morning, his mother called and said he's getting his Purple Heart and he's on his way home.
When Tank came back from Iraq with a good portion of his arm blown out, he took me aside and he said, there were so many situations that I went into in Iraq and I recognized things that you had told me about. And I thought, thank God, he got it.
And his mother came over to him, to Mike, and said, you kept my son alive. You did it. You brought him home alive. And I'm so proud of him.
PTSD comes out of being able to understand the humanity of the terrible situation you were in. The wisdom you have about words that most people take for granted, like trust and honesty, loyalty and courage. Those words have a meaning that others can never understand. And that wisdom that's been given to you is a gift that you can pass on to others.
Feel the feelings. It's okay to cry. It's okay to get mad. It's good to journal a lot of stuff. But the feelings have to be expressed.
To understand PTSD is to know that it is always going to be there. You can live with PTSD on your own terms once you realize what the limitations are and accept those limitations. You can be very comfortable and you can do a life, and happily.
That was then and this is now. I found my way back here somehow. I knew you'd have to let me go. I told you once, I told you so. Take me down, you can hold me, but you can't hold what's within. Pull me around, push me to the limit. Maybe I may bend, but we both know I'm not going. I will not be broken. I will not be broken. I will not be broken. I will not be